to Robot Unicorn, hosted by my parents, Jess and Scott. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
All right, Jess, welcome back. We're wearing the same clothes as last week. Interesting.
Oh, wow.
I wonder how that
Fascinating.
happened. So last week, we discussed punitive discipline measures or punishments, like physical punishment, spanking, pinching, flicking, smacking, whatever, all that. Harsh verbal discipline, so yelling, belittling, humiliating. We talked about threats and bribes. We actually didn't talk too much about rewards. We should have, but
Yeah, that could maybe be a future episode.
we can talk about that different time. But today we want to talk specifically about timeouts and the claims that they are evidence-based, which on its face is actually true. I will say, after having looked through a bunch of peer-reviewed articles and studies that have been done, timeouts are actually considered to be evidence-based and are used in a lot of evidence-based, parenting methodologies.
Yeah, like positive parenting.
There's positive parenting program, the Incredible Years, parent-child interaction therapy. So it is known to be evidence-based in those specific programs. What I want to ask you about is why you steer clear of timeouts in general. Because the claim, and I mean, people have asked you this, like you mentioned in the previous episode, people are asking you if it's evidence-based and you provide evidence-based practices for parenting, why would you not then say that timeouts are okay? So that's my question for you.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of reasons. And so, yeah, I just want to touch on that too. It's like, I know that timeouts have been taught for many years as an evidence-based method to reduce behavior. And that's why I wanted to clarify, to reduce behavior. And so for me, in my approach as a developmentalist, I'm looking at two things. I talked about that in the last episode. So I'm looking at the evidence on discipline, right? And so the evidence on discipline shows authoritative discipline, which is high warmth, high structure, is the best type of discipline for the long-term outcomes for kids. And many people would say that there is a place for timeouts inside of that structured piece. But I also look from a child development lens. And I look, as a developmentalist, what I'm looking at is this appropriate from a child development standpoint? And what does this do to the relationship between the parent and the child? So that's not just looking at behavior. That's looking like the big picture all over the relationship. The history of timeouts, what we need to understand is, for a long time, spankings were the thing that was taught, right? How to change behavior. We spank our children, or we inflict physical pain in order to punish them to change behavior.
Yeah, that way they know that behavior is wrong. And if you do that behavior again, you'll hurt. And
that we talked about last week's episode. Listen to that if you have questions about spanking. So timeouts were introduced as a way to help parents get off spanking, right? So a lot of parents were spanking their kids. Psychologists were starting to see, and the evidence is starting to show, that spanking is not the most effective way to change behavior. In fact, it has a lot of really negative outcomes. And so these psychologists, or people who had been teaching spanking for so many years, had to change their tune because the research was showing us that that was not effective anymore. Timeouts came in as a great alternative for parents that didn't involve physical punishment and helped a child, take a break essentially from the behavior that they were doing, think about what they've done, and then re-enter the situation in the hopes that they will learn their lesson because they've been taken away from the thing that's really positive that they're enjoying to do. They have to sit alone for a couple of minutes, think about what they've done, and hopefully they stop doing that behavior, right? And there is evidence to show that if children do that, they take a break, by themselves for X amount of minutes, and they come back, over time, they learn that that behavior is not okay because there's that punishment there, right? Or that removal of the positive stimuli that they have, the positive reinforcement.
Yeah, which a lot of the research says that, but if I remember Psychology 101 that I took in university, removing a positive reinforcement is like saying negative punishment. You're removing something positive, therefore it's an in psychological terms, a negative punishment. So it's still a punishment.
Yeah, timeouts are a punishment. It's important. So because of that, a lot of psychologists, psychotherapists, a lot of doctors started teaching timeouts because we wanted to get parents away from spanking, which makes total sense. And there's evidence to suggest that some behavioral change can happen, right? And that's where it started entering into all of these programs. So that's the history on timeouts. Now, there's some flaws, and this is why I don't teach timeouts and I don't promote them. One of the flaws of timeouts is that in even this evidence, and maybe you have the definition there, everything it says is when it's used properly, it can change behavior. But so much research says parents don't use it properly the majority of the time, right? So parents hear the words, timeouts are effective for changing behavior. So they tell themselves, oh, perfect. So when my child's misbehaving, I can just send them to their room on their own to cry, or I can sit them on the stairs for however long I want them to sit there, or I can yell at them from across the room, go to timeout, stop hitting your brother. And what's happened is it's just become a way of parenting, and parents don't really even know what the effective way to use it is. It's just blanket, I'm using a timeout. So that's the first thing. And not even close to the only problem that I have with it, but that's the first big problem I have is definitions, right? And it's very loose when it comes to timeout. Like every parent I talk to pretty much has a different definition as to what a timeout is. And in my own opinion, I'm not basing this on like a study that I've seen recently. In my own opinion, if you're using a timeout, like let's say our daughter is having a really hard time, she's crying, she's mad, she keeps hitting her sister with a toy. And I'm like, hey, let's go to your room, let's take a timeout together, and let's just calm down before we re-enter the living room. And I've done that recently. And together we'll go to her room, maybe we'll read some books or we'll do something to kind of just regulate the nervous system, and then we come back downstairs again and she's feeling refreshed and less dysregulated, and we're good to go. So I use it in that way.
I'd say based on the research that I was finding, and I will say your comments from before about parents don't use it correctly, that's 100% the case. The research all the research I could find was saying that it's effective under very strict protocols and done never as a punishment, never, like it's
only when the child's calm, only when
it's incredibly strict, the protocols you should be using for it to be considered effective.
Yes.
Yeah, so the time in, that is correct. What I will say is that some could argue that by doing a time in with the child that just hit the other child, you're now reinforcing that behavior of them hitting their sister. So what would you have to say to that?
This is when we get to specifics again. Like, it so depends on the situation. Like, why is my child hitting their sister? Are they hitting them because they're so dysregulated and exhausted and they haven't had a snack after school, and then their sister just like did one thing and they're 3 years old and they lost their mind? Like, yeah, then I would probably take them away with me, get them a snack, help them regulate, and they're fine. And I wouldn't really be that worried. I'm reinforcing the hitting. What I'm doing is calming the nervous system, right? But if I have a child who's intentionally hitting, looking at me to see what kind of attention or connection they're going to get from me when they're hitting, and I'm taking them and, oh, honey, you're hitting, oh, yeah, I'm probably reinforcing the hitting. I would have a different response. That's why my thing that I always talk about nurture first is get curious. We have to figure out what the root cause is of this behavior. Dysregulation and seeking connection, I will have two different responses for. So again, another reason I don't love timeouts is because if that's the blanket approach we're using, sometimes you're reinforcing the behavior. I've seen kids who have had timeouts, aka being sent to their room or sent to the principal's office, reinforcing the behavior, which is, I don't want to be in this room right now.
Right.
And so then they learn, when I misbehave, I get sent to be in my room by myself, or I get sent to the principal's office. I'd rather be there. And so it actually gets a need met for them. So this is like my problem. This is another one of my big problems with timeouts is if it's just a blanket thing that you use, we're often missing the point. Like, we're missing the tuning in with, why is my child behaving this way? And we might actually be reinforcing the behavior we don't want to see more of.
Okay, so you say using it as a blanket method. But what if you don't use it as a blanket method, but you only use it for those situations where, let's say, our youngest is hitting one of their sisters, which doesn't happen incredibly often. But if it happens once every week or every couple weeks that they're hitting someone with a toy, that's not constant. So is that a problem to use it then?
So again, a problem and is it developmentally appropriate? Two different questions. Okay, so in the evidence, like you were saying, in the evidence-based timeouts, it's very clear the definitions. One of the clear definitions in evidence-based timeouts is the child is calm. Okay, how often do you have a child hitting who is also calm? Like in my opinion, very rare that a child is just hitting and regulated at the same time. So the idea of putting a hitting 3-year-old, let's say, onto the step, which is a commonplace, like a stair for a timeout, putting a hitting 3-year-old into timeout by themselves is just not developmentally appropriate because...
Well, based on what I'm reading, they don't necessarily have to be, or what I read, they don't necessarily have to be calm.
Okay.
Sitting in their timeout. The technical definition is, and I think this is a behavioral definition, but timeout from positive reinforcement.
Okay.
And it removes a child from parental attention and enjoyable stimuli at the same time. So you are ignoring them. They're sitting and they're just trying to calm down. And then once they're calm, which again, it's not used as like in the heat of the moment. You're not angry and saying you're in timeout and you're incredibly angry. You're supposed to be, as a parent, incredibly boring about the whole thing. You're bringing them to their step. You're saying, okay, you have to sit here and I just want you to calm down. And when you're calm, you can come join again. Come join and play with us again. And then you just leave them. You're not trying to punish them. You're not trying to, I mean, technically the term means timeout punishment. Timeout from positive reinforcement means timeout negative punishment.
Yeah.
But that's
so I get the logic behind it. Like I totally get it. And I can see how for some kids, maybe that can be effective and just like the little break that they need. And I think for some kids, they're engaged. Like if we think about behavior, they're engaging in this behavior because they're dysregulated. There's too much going on and maybe they just need a break, you know? And in that way, in my own head, I would phrase that as a break. Like, hey, hon, you need a little break. Why don't we sit on the step for a sec? I'm right here. Let's say I'm like tending to the baby. I'm right here. But why don't you just sit on the step for a sec, have a break. Let's take some deep breaths before you go back in.
Yeah.
That's how I would phrase it. I wouldn't phrase it as timeout. I think because I think the word has so much baggage to it that as soon as you say timeout, there's certain things like we're thinking, you know, sending the kid to the room alone who's crying and screaming, don't come out until you stop crying. Okay, so then here's where I bring in the child development piece. You think about a toddler's brain, how do they learn how to regulate their emotions with a regulated caregiver? The problem I have with timeouts the majority of the time is that, again, we are using a child's attachment to us and closeness to us against them.
Yeah.
Like they love us so much that they want to behave. So we say, I'll withdraw my love until you behave. And I don't think that's healthy. And I don't think that's what we want to teach our kids long term. Like I think the withdrawing love and affection from a child in order to get them to act the way that you want in any other relationship would be toxic.
It's still a manipulative way of getting someone to do
if
what
I
you
did
want.
that to you,
Yeah.
that would be considered me being toxic towards you. But to our kids, somehow that's okay. And that's my big problem with timeouts. And because we know, like, again, there's new research. There's more research out there. Now we understand child development better than we ever have before. So a way of looking at parenting that was very behavioral in nature, now we have more data on child development. And so we have to consider that. Just how when spanking was talked about, we had to consider timeouts because we knew that there was a better option. Now, in my opinion, sure, timeouts are okay. They're there. Like, not okay, but timeouts are there. They're an option. And we have more data on child development and how kids' brains work. And so to just simply say, well, we should still use them because they change behavior. Well, my goal is not to just change my child's behavior. My goal is also to teach them how to regulate their emotions, to help them learn new skills, to get curious about why they're having a hard time, to show them that I'm in a connected relationship with them. and to teach them how to regulate through repeated exposures to my calm. That's my goal as a parent. And I don't see, for me, how timeouts fit into that goal. And then also, I see a child doesn't have the ability to think logically or reasonably when they're upset and dysregulated. So the idea that I get my child to sit on a step as they're crying for X amount of minutes to reflect on the actions that they just did is not realistic either. And, in a nutshell, TED Talk, those are my kind of key reasons why I don't promote timeouts. But I will say quiet breaks can be really helpful. And so it's just in the way you phrase it to your kid.
No, that's a different method, though.
Yeah, that's different. But I think where timeouts, sometimes people are like, it did help my kid. But what they're really doing is just giving their kid a break from the overstimulating situation, right? Yeah. And that's different to me.
So I touched on this earlier, but the research that I found on this either very annoyingly did not describe or define what the appropriate use of timeouts was, and then said, well, based on this 30-minute questionnaire that 450 parents filled out, and it was still a peer-reviewed article, but we see no issue with timeouts done properly and negative outcomes for their children, like mentally, emotionally, cognitively, all of that. And I found that kind of annoying. But any of the ones that did define it said it has to be done in a very specific way. It can't be used as a punishment or as, like, you can't be angry as a parent when you're doing it. And if you can't control your ability to, or your anger in that moment, and you can't calmly put your child into the timeout, then right there,
don't do it.
It's not as effective anymore. The other thing that a lot of these articles were suggesting was that essentially you have to have an authoritative home. So you have to have that warm structure in your home. And then if you are consistent in your use of boundaries, and a timeout is one of the things that you use to, let's say, punish your child for doing something, but they're aware of that ahead of time, it can be effective. But a lot of these articles suggested that most parents have no idea how to actually do it effectively, or we're not capable. Like, I don't know that I would be capable of doing that in a way that I wasn't annoyed or angry.
Yeah. And also, like, for, let's say, our home with 3 kids, could we really do like so much structure in terms of the timeout every single time our child was doing something? I don't know. And like, one of the other like issues I have, even with all those things, where's the new skills?
Yes. So that's another thing that none of those touched on. The articles that I found, and this makes sense, are purely behavioral. So they're saying it's effective because it changes the behavior in that moment. Some of them were suggesting that it can change behavior long-term as well. But again, the only situations where that was the case is if it was done properly.
Yeah, I don't know. I struggle because what is the need? Like, what is, like, so you can, in my opinion, like, you could do the timeout perfect, right? But if the child is engaging in the hitting to get the timeout because they're overstimulated and they need a break, you are not teaching them new way to ask for a break.
But I think that's what the research was suggesting, which is why I found all this research incredibly annoying, because it's not like they're looking that deep into it. It's just...
It's so behavioral.
It's very much, if you do it in the appropriate way. So that means, though, that in an authoritative home, you're understanding that your child isn't just seeking attention for that, like, and doing that behavior because they're seeking attention from you. You should be able to understand why they're doing it.
Right.
Right, which is, I think, unreasonable. I don't even know if you, in the moment, if you have all 3 kids upset, if you would even be able to do that in that moment. You might be able to reflect on it later. So what I found was that, yes, it's evidence-based. That is true. If you look at in-the-moment behaviors and the reduction of them, if you do it in the exact right environment with the exact right protocol or method.
And still,
That's not saying there's no better ways to do it. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that's what the evidence suggests, is that it is actually effective, but you have to do it perfectly, essentially,
And
to do it for it to be effective.
here's a question or pushback I have for you. So if it's effective, let's say, in changing hitting, okay, so the child stops hitting, but they still have that same need. So then they start kicking. Like what I'm wondering is, if we're not, like, if the goal is to not teach a new skill, right? That's my goal in discipline with my kids, our kids, is to show them what to
again,
do.
this is supposed to be used with like the positive parenting method.
With all the other
So it's supposed to be
things.
used with everything else. If
Yeah.
you use it with everything else, and again, that's why I'm saying it has to be done in the perfect environment for it to be truly effective.
Right.
So you have to explain, like, next time we have to go through this. You have to do it in this way, or you shouldn't hit, because you have to think about it from their perspective. Like if you had a toy and they wanted it and they hit you, like, you can't go.
Yeah, okay.
You do have to go through all of those things on top of timeouts. And again, timeouts can't be used as a punishment. It's just for essentially calming them down.
Yeah.
That's it.
Right.
And you're ignoring them. You're just letting them sit on their own just to calm down.
Which I guess maybe some kids have the skills to do.
Yeah, right.
But you also would need to tune in with your child and see if your child can actually do that on their own and not be adding minutes to the timeout timer because they're not calming themselves down.
Right.
A skill that they don't have.
Yeah, again, all of this that's the problem I had with any of the research I found. And maybe if you're listening and you know of better research, I went through, I don't know how many different articles. I think in preparation for this one, the last one, I had 70 articles that I went through. I honestly, again, was trying to find a way to debate you on this. Mm-hmm. But what I found was the studies were designed in such specific environments to study such specific behaviors that it's hard for me to say, yes, this makes sense to use everywhere all the time. Like, it's almost like saying this worked on lab rats, so therefore it works on every single animal that exists. Maybe that's a poor
No, I think that's
analogy,
fair.
but it kind of felt that way. When
It works in the lab, so it should work in real life.
Yeah.
When you're talking about parents in real life who are, of course, dysregulated and upset, and then they hear time, and like, that's my problem. I guess that's when I see people who say they're psychologists or data analysts or whatever, and they say timeouts are evidence-based. And parents take that as, oh, sweet. Okay, great. This is such a good tool for me. But when I see that in clinical practice being used in real life, it's go to your room until you're calm. Sit in there till you're calm. The child's screaming and crying in their room. They're 2 years old. They cannot regulate their emotions on their own. Mm-hmm. And we're saying that's evidence-based. And like, parents are like, no, this is evidence-based.
Well, even older than that, it doesn't.
Yeah, even older, 5.
Based on the discussions we've had on this podcast, that's not developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
Even potentially up until like 7 years old.
Right.
And even still, there's alternatives.
Yeah. And
Better
even,
alternatives. Yeah. That's kind of what I was coming to the conclusion of. It's not as though it's not possible to use timeouts, because they can potentially be effective. Mm-hmm. But if you measure them against alternatives, like using the authoritative method and using, let's say, a time in, so you're instead trying to connect with them and calm them, and then eventually teaching them and all that stuff, but you're not leaving them on their own and making them worried that you're not going to love them anymore internally because they did something bad, so they have to go to their room or sit on the step. Like, there are alternatives that aren't also potentially harmful for attachment.
Yeah.
Which I think is the key. Like, based on what you're saying, I was trying to figure out how do we reconcile that timeouts are evidence-based for behavior, but potentially harmful for attachment, after I read through all of this.
Yeah. And I've spoken with some of the leading psychologists in the field of child development who would say that timeouts, in the way many parents use them, like go to your room until you're calm, can actually be more harmful than spanking. Because spanking, there's like an element of like, I'm still with you. Whereas timeouts can be an element of like, you are by yourself with your feelings, and I like remove my love until you act in the way that I want you to. Not in the way you're talking about, but in the way that they're often used. And
So that confuses me a little bit. That is hard for me to...
Emotionally.
Yeah, emotionally.
More difficult because let's say that is every time you misbehave, your parent just sends you to be by yourself, right? Or every time you don't act as like in this perfect way, your parent sends you to be by yourself. What message does that give you long term, right?
Right.
It's like the revoking of just even my physical self from you until you behave the way I want you to. Mm-hmm. And I think you and I, and our goal in just parenting and everything we teach on this podcast is not to raise perfect angels who never, who feel so afraid of us that they don't, that's why they behave, right? We want them to behave because of that right relationship, not because of fear of our response or because they're worried we'll revoke our love from them. And that's like the greater, like that's not the evidence-based timeouts or whatever, but that's just what we see and how it's actually used in real life. And this is where I have such an issue with people just saying blanket statements. It's evidence-based and it won't ruin attachment without, you have to talk about all of the pieces of it in order to have like a robust discussion on it.
Yeah, and the articles that I found on it being evidence-based, so it working and also not ruining attachment. Mm-hmm. The methodology of like that parents need to use in order to use them correctly mm-hmm. The barrier is so high mm-hmm. that to me it seems like it's just a better idea to say no to timeouts in general mm-hmm. because there are alternatives. And yeah, timeouts, like, yes, they are evidence-based for a specific outcome under specific conditions of implementation. And yeah, maybe there's some trade-offs with development, but that is unclear to me based on everything I was able to find. So
at the end of the day, would you feel comfortable using timeouts with any of our kids?
No. I mean, at this point, no. Based on... And I mean, there might be some inherent bias because you've been talking to me about a lot of this stuff for years, but I was truthfully trying to kind of prove you wrong when I was going through the research because I was like, maybe there is some legitimacy to it.
You can't have a full discussion without actually leaning into this and fully reading the research and trying to prove me wrong. I think it's important that you do that. So I'm glad you did.
Yeah, and I read some different articles like written by people that are well known in the field, and they just asked a couple questions or a few questions, and they followed the do no harm principle. Mm-hmm. So some of them were asking, rather than asking, does timeouts or this discipline method work to stop the behavior? So rather than asking that, the better questions are, is this safe for long-term development? And are there less harmful alternatives? And I thought that was an interesting way to frame it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard to think that in the moment.
Mm-hmm. That's why I think for parents, these decisions around punishments, timeouts, or the other ones we talked about in the last episode, you have to make those decisions before you're ever in the moment. Like for me, timeouts have always been just off the table. It's never been an option. As soon as it's an option, then you're using it in the moment because you're dysregulated. Mm-hmm. I think like in our parenting course, like the first thing I do is like talk about your negotiables and non-negotiables discipline and just have that so that you're not pulling from a strategy in the moment when you're already having a hard time. Because I think that's when parents are using it a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then later they regret it. But if this or spanking or threats or whatever, this is just not something you want to do, then you need to tell yourself that's not an option for me mm-hmm. in this moment. And that will help you connect with your kids.
Well, and try and find
and you'll find different options. Yeah.
Other options. Yeah. Which I mean, the time in, like you were explaining, sitting with them in that and trying to regulate them. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just the typical way we help kids through their difficult emotions, right? Their big feelings. Like we've talked about, the parent-child relationship quality is more predictive of positive outcomes than any specific disciplinary technique, which I think is true across the board. But if we follow that and the do no harm principle, if that's what we're trying to accomplish, I feel like there is a risk in doing harm with timeouts because they're evidence-based, mm-hmm. but they're not measured against all aspects of child development either. Mm-hmm. And it sort of goes against what we know about child development. So again, the most important thing, you're not supposed to do things perfectly, but the relationship that you have with your child is the foundation. And then you were talking about skills versus compliance. So like if we want to actually teach our kids skills, putting them in timeout doesn't necessarily teach them, or punishing them doesn't actually teach them the skill that they need the next time they're in that situation. Or, I mean, with young kids, it could take 100 times before they actually learn. So effective discipline teaches that self-regulation, empathy, and problem solving rather than just achieving immediate compliance.
Yeah.
I mean, there's maybe situations where your child is running across the road and you need to yank them back before they run into the road. And that might hurt, but you need to do that so they don't get hit by a car.
Of course, safety first, always. Yeah.
But I think those situations are pretty rare.
Oh, I agree. I think you're nailing it.
I wrote kind of a final thoughts for this just because of how much this took me a lot of energy and effort to put this.
He's been putting this together for a long time, so.
I think skepticism regarding broad claims of evidence-based practices, such as those sometimes made with timeouts or other discipline strategies. So that skepticism, I think, is often warranted. I think it's important. I'm highly skeptical. That's why I try and prove you wrong. And I think it's important to ask so evidence-based, let's say timeouts, evidence-based for what specific outcome, under what specific conditions of implementation, and with what potential trade-offs for other areas of development. So I think that's important to think about with all research when we're talking about parenting.
Yeah.
A technique like the timeout can be evidence-based for reducing non-compliance in specific populations of children when implemented or used with very strict protocols, and when used under like a whole comprehensive
Parenting program.
Yeah, under a whole comprehensive parenting program. So if you're literally following everything in Jess's Parenting Little Kids course to a T, it can potentially help. But there's a big risk in not doing it properly if you don't follow the strict protocols.
Yeah. And I teach the time in the parenting course.
Right. And this narrow definition of effectiveness doesn't mean that concerns about its impact on child's emotional well-being or attachment security when it's used often in isolation or as a punishment. There's still that risk there. Yeah. So I think evidence-based, we talk about evidence-based as well, but it's more, I think we try to talk more in broad terms, like this is the general consensus. And we try and take behavior and development into account, where I think a lot of research, they're focused on one aspect but not the other. So evidence-based should not be a blanket endorsement, and it still needs a skeptical eye on the scope, limitations, and broader implications of the evidence. And by understanding, I think, all of these complexities, parents and caregivers can make more informed choices that truly nurture their child's potential, which I think we can say is kind of the main goal of parenting.
Yeah.
It's nurturing a child's true potential.
And knowing that comes into play when the child is in that right relationship with their parent, right? And I think the fear with not using a timeout is, well, then will my kid learn how to behave? And the answer is yes. They will learn how to behave without punishments through your guidance, through your co-regulation, your modeling and teaching new skills. You don't need to use timeouts to teach them how to behave.
Yeah. It doesn't mean that you're not setting boundaries. You don't let them do whatever they want, but it just means that these like punitive measures and timeouts are not the most effective way of actually doing those things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's really important for parents to know. It's not like, oh, all hope is lost then.
Right.
Like, actually, there's a ton of hope. There's so many other strategies and tools we have now that maybe we didn't have when timeouts became super popular in the 90s, and early 2000s. We have more tools now, so we can use them and support our kids and help their development and emotional well-being as well.
Yeah, and honestly, lately, because we've been doing the episodes in this manner, where I get to do a bunch of research and understand a bit more of the child development and behavioral aspects, I've looked at our kids and I'm almost more excited to be their parent now because I'm starting to understand more of what we're doing and the reason why we're doing these things.
Yeah.
And we're parenting in this way. And the fact that I'm trying to unlock for them their full potential.
Yeah. And it's all right there for us.
Yeah.
Right. It's all right there. That's the thing.
It's kind of exciting.
It's the best job in the world. Like it truly is. It's the most important thing we can do is nurture their potential that's there instead of just crush it out of them, to make them these compliant kids. Like it's all there and we just have to be there to facilitate it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed this, Jess. And
I
hopefully
loved it.
Listeners enjoyed it. It was a little more sciencey
Yeah.
than in the past, but it was kind of exciting for me to.
I loved
deep
reading the
dive.
research. This is all stuff I've read, but I think it's really important to bring it in. So it's not just like just saying it,
Yeah.
We have the data to support it. So thank you all. This is great.
Perfect. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop. And if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here and we'll talk to you again next week.